Okay. Welcome everyone to this seminar of it's the week 7 seminar of the Caribbean Studies Network, which is hosted by the Oxford Research Center in the Humanities. My name is María del Pilar Blanco, and I am one of the members of the Caribbean Studies Network, and also I'm the Torch Academic Champion. It is a great pleasure to be hosting Dr. Katerina González-Seligmann, who is our speaker today, and she's going to be talking about her new project, Writing the Caribbean in Magazine Time. Now, this is a project that represents Katerina's new book, which will come out later this summer, and it'll be published by Rutgers University Press. I've already done my pre-order, so I hope that after this one, everybody does the same. Katerina researches Latin American and Caribbean literature and history. She focuses on intertextual literary forms, including literary magazines, translation, influence, textual evolution, and also adaptations. She's also quite interested in discussions of anti-racist rhetoric, aesthetics, the literature the idea of literary infrastructure, how literary infrastructures affect the way that certain areas in certain geographical areas can produce a literary culture. And Katerina, we're going to be hearing about this today. She has published in a number of journals, the South Atlantic Quarterly, Small Axe, MLN, Modern Language Notes, and the CLR James Journal. And she has also just become a member of the Emerson group in the Institute for Francophone Manuscript Studies at the École Normale Supérieure. Alongside that, I have failed to say the most important thing. She's an assistant professor at Emerson College. This is her most her position at the moment, and we are so happy to have you here, Katerina, discuss the project that will come out in you said August by Rutgers, and that's Writing the Caribbean in Magazine Time. So the structure of this, as we normally do it with Caribbean Studies Journal, the Caribbean Studies Network, is that we are going to hear Katerina for about 25-30 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to a discussion. I ask everyone in the audience, if you have any questions, do start putting them into the chat. There's a box in the bottom that you can start typing in. Don't leave it till the very last minute, because so if you have a question pops into your mind, just put it in the chat and I'll read them out to Katerina, and we'll have ample time at the end for discussion. So without further ado, Katerina, do take it away.
Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you also, David. And it's really an honor to be here with you. And this is the very first time that I will be presenting about my book as a finished thing, as something that is in the process of becoming available in the world. And thank you, all of you who are here. I'm very excited to see some of the names of people whose work is very important to this book. So what I'm going to do is to first talk to you a little bit about how I came to this particular project, and then I'm going to read some from the introductory first chapter of the book to give you a sense of some of the sort of most important vectors of the book's trajectory. And then I look forward to your questions and to a conversation with you and with Maria. So I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. All right, and Maria, can you just let me know that the screen share is good and that you're hearing me, so that
I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, and you see the PDF?
Yeah, it's perfect. Yeah.
Okay, so here is my book cover that I'm very grateful to my brother Kyle Engstrom for designing. And so the particular project that has become this book grows out of two sort of, very important and long-standing interests that relate to the kind of shaping of my person. The first is an interest in pan-Caribbeanness. As someone of Cuban descent on my mother's side, growing up and becoming an adult in the world and connecting with people from different parts of the Caribbean, I've always been struck by this sense of belonging to people who in many ways are from very different backgrounds and yet share this sort of amorphous regional space and culture to a large extent. And then, you know, in part related to that and based on sort of the entirety of the trajectory of my background and my experience growing up between Florida and Texas, as I came to become an academic, it was very clear that I was interested in Caribbean studies and also committed more largely. And even though this is true for a lot of us in Caribbean studies, I think it's important in this context to say that though my work has always been oriented towards disrupting, debunking the kinds of Eurocentric myths that fuel the violence of racism and xenophobia and other identity-based forms of violence. And so between this sort of commitment and this fascination, I started to develop a project as a graduate student at Brown that sought to look at connections established in intertextual moments of Caribbean literature between different parts of the region, interlingual connections, and to that end, I did this earlier study of the translation of Aimé Césaire's Notebook of a Return to the Native Land in Cuba by Lidia Cabrera. And that sort of became this kind of first major research project out of which I thought that I would develop a project about those kinds of connections. And literary magazines in the Caribbean seemed to be the best sources for finding connections that hadn't yet been found. But as I started researching magazines, I became somewhat overwhelmed by not really knowing what to do with a lot of what I read in magazines. And I felt like over and over again, I found discrepancies between the literary history that I had learned about the Caribbean in various contexts and the kinds of things that emerged in magazines. And I didn't think at the time, now it's sort of, there's been a proliferation of work on magazines, and there had always been some very important work on magazines in the Latin American context, but somehow I didn't think I could really do this, that it would be allowed, that it would be possible. I didn't know how to formulate a project on magazines, but I was very supported by the people on my committee, and I started to sort of reformulate my research to focus more explicitly on magazines. And as I looked for how to focus a project on Caribbean magazines, and I was interested in a kind of an approach that looked at magazines produced in English, Spanish, French, and other creolized linguistic forms between them, I started to see that my magazine research and my prior interest in connections between the Caribbean did actually have a kind of, in some ways, an unexpected resonance between them, as I started to notice that the magazines that I looked at in the 1940s were doing similar work with the articulation of pan-Caribbean discourse, or locating themselves in the Caribbean to give sort of different versions of how I think about that kind of work. And eventually I came to the project that I have now that I will read to you a little bit from. So, all right, so I'm going to go into my first chapter, and there's sort of three major vectors that bring together this book, and I'm going to look at two of them. So one of them is Pan-Caribbean discourse, and the other, as Maria brought up earlier, is the idea of literary infrastructure in relation to literary magazines. The third that maybe I can get to later is the idea of location writing that I sort of positioned to bring together the the other two vectors, and get more into kind of what the significance is of pan-Caribbean discourse to the medium of the literary magazine as it proliferates in the Caribbean context. So here I go. The year World War II ended, 1945, has been hailed as a turning point of empire. In some genealogies, 1945 marks the transition from dominion to independence for the colonized world. However, the initiation of the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, may be the most transformative event of that year for the global political economy. The IMF established the US dollar as a normative global currency, overtaking the dominance of the British pound, and paved the way for a new style of imperialism. That year ushered in the framework of development that continues to normalize the distribution of economic power, facilitated by the history and predominance of imperial relations. I maintain that the transformative force of 1945 dramatically reconfigured the Caribbean archipelago, as I trace the decade of the 1940s when the dominant paradigm of development had not yet become normative, and multiple forms of anti-imperial critique were incubated in and around Caribbean literary magazines. The decade ushered in numerous changes for the region. Plans to implement the West Indies Federation as a transitional governing body for the British colonies in the Caribbean were put into motion during the second half of the 1940s. In 1946, the remaining French colonies in the Caribbean would transition to states or départements of France. The Cuban Revolution's 1959 triumph that would become an iconic symbol of the region would be incubated during the 1940s after the Cuban Revolution of 1933 and the subsequent legalization of the Cuban Communist Party in 1938. As these political developments were underway, Caribbean peoples experienced a sharpening of archipelagic vision that was as important for geopolitics as it was for literature. During World War II, literature produced abroad would circulate even less than usual in the Caribbean. And perhaps due to the resulting demand for reading material, literary magazines featuring many of the writers who would go on to become spotlights of Caribbean literature proliferated. Amid paper shortages brought on by the war and the disparaging of homegrown literature over foreign imports prevailing among middle-class reading audiences throughout the region, literary magazines contributed to uplifting locally and regionally produced literature, fomenting cultural capital for Caribbean literature, and bolstering political transformations. As I argue throughout the book, literary magazines produced during the 1940s assembled and advanced the debates that structure many of the Caribbean's political, social, and aesthetic trajectories until the present. This book highlights the centrality of the magazine form to the history of literature and politics in the region and examines the aesthetic and political strategies authors, editors, critics, and publishers used to imaginatively construct and circulate the Caribbean as a literary and geopolitical location. The potential for pan-Caribbean community that circulated in and around literary magazines during this decade gave form to the possibility of a decolonizing transformation. A perfect example of pan-Caribbean vision as a decolonial horizon appears in a letter that leading Martinican poet, playwright, and politician Aimé Césaire wrote in April 1945 upon his return to Martinique from Haiti, the same year that he concluded Tropique, the literary magazine he had co-edited since 1941, and launched his political career. As he described his great admiration for working class Haitians to his friend and comrade Henri Seyrig, who then served as a cultural attaché for the Free French, Césaire remarked that he had consolidated his Antillean vision. Je crois qu'il y a un génie antillais, un style antillais. Pour fixer mes idées à ce sujet, il me tarde de connaître une Antille de langue espagnole, Cuba, une Antille de langue anglaise, la Jamaïque. Although Césaire lays claim to a pan-Caribbean genius and style in this passage, his curiosity to test this vision by visiting Spanish-speaking Cuba and English-speaking Jamaica also reveals that his regional vision was under construction at this time. Césaire contributes to that construction even in this moment, moreover, as the vision he proffers hinges on a linguistic bridge between French and Spanish, une Antille, the singular form of Antilles he employs in reference to Cuba and Jamaica. As Cora Véron has indicated, the lexeme Antille is itself a neologism in French, expressed here through what Césaire would later go on to call géographie cordiale, or the geography of the heart. The singular Antille also recalls a trace of Caribbean construction that predates Colón's famed 1492 voyage of imperial conquest. An island called Antilla is recorded on a Portolan map as early as 1424, and since classical antiquity, there are records and myths surrounding islands in the Atlantic, the most famous of which is the myth of Atlantis. These myths resonate in the inscription of Antilles that would be used to name the Caribbean after 1492, and the exoticist imaginaries projected onto the region from imperial worldviews. Césaire's division of the island into singular bodies, alongside his suggestion of a collective Antillean way of being and thinking, evokes the ambivalence of archipelagic vision potentialized by literary magazines during the 1940s. Even as Césaire neologizes a singular form of Antille instead of employing île or Caraïbe, his letter demonstrates that he was at once curious to translate Cuba and Jamaica into his conception of the Francophone islands, but also unable at this time yet to access them. The limits of Césaire's prophetic regional vision are less remarkable than his desire and efforts to overcome them. For the Caribbean region had been constructed primarily in fragments that correspond to its multiple imperial histories. As Franklin Knight has reflected about the competing European empires that colonized the region, each empire tended to refer to the Caribbean as if their sector represented it as a whole. I have found that this tendency persists in the anti-imperial tradition, shaping intellectual discourse, defining the Caribbean region until the present day. As such, I understand pan-Caribbean discourse as synecdoche, or as a mode of signification that enunciates a whole by referring to part of the region. Césaire's own pan-Caribbean vision, like the region making of the 1940s literary periodicals central to this book, was on the edge of the imperial view of the archipelago. Writing the Caribbean in magazine Time tells the story of the Caribbean archipelago as a particular kind of choice for literary and political representation. In particular, this book excavates what choosing to write the Caribbean archipelago or not meant to the literary, social, and political transformations incubated by literary magazines during the 1940s. I examined the potent power of representing Caribbean locations in and around magazines, highlighting location strategies that increased the archipelago's visibility and fomented regional unity in geopolitical and literary world systems. I interrogate how magazine editors, creative writers, and literary critics have deployed and resisted the Caribbean as a locus of enunciation for their work in Spanish, French, English, and Creolized linguistic forms. In the literary, political, and cartographic archives probed by this book, the Caribbean, named as such or as Las Antillas, des Antilles, or the West Indies, tends to evoke the archipelago as a decolonial horizon. The Caribbean as a region repeats itself as a creatively constructed location with purpose, to articulate a colonial record in common of racial and gendered violence that persists into the present, to imagine an anti-imperial and in some cases anti-capitalist regional and planetary solidarity, and or to offer political, social, and aesthetic alternatives to the hierarchies buttressed by imperial infrastructures. The literary magazines generated during the 1940s that I focus on for this book would catapult the disparate literatures woven by decades of magazine work into, hold on, wrong page. They would catapult the disparate literatures woven by decades of magazine work into greater international circulation and contribute significantly to social, political, and aesthetic frameworks for decolonization, including pan-Caribbean discourse. In Martinique, Tropique was born in 1941 and had a 5-year run. It was co-edited by Aimé Césaire with the writer and cultural theorist. He was married to Suzanne Césaire and their comrade and collaborator, the philosopher René Ménil. In Cuba, two magazines in conflict with each other, Gaceta del Caribe and Orígenes, emerged at the same time in the spring of 1944. Gaceta del Caribe was a brief publication that only ran through December of the same year. It was co-edited by leading poet, chronicler of Cuban society, and political activist Nicolás Guillén, with his comrades in literature and politics, the poets and literary critics Mirta Aguirre, José Antonio Portuondo, and Ángel Ogier. Orígenes was the culminating manifestation of several literary magazines edited or co-edited by leading poet and literary critic José Lezama Lima and his assemblage of high modernist aesthetes, known posteriorly as the Orígenes Group. Orígenes would run until 1956 under the helm of Lezama Lima with the literary translator and critic José Rodríguez Feo. In 1942, Barbados, the poet, fiction writer, and actor Frank Collymore would begin to edit the literary magazine BIM, which he continued to edit with various co-editors until 1973. BIM would begin as an outlet for local literature in Bridgetown and expand gradually to become a broadly West Indian publication. So although I have investigated numerous Caribbean magazines for this book, these four magazines are the focus of the book. I have by no means been exhaustive in my research on Caribbean magazines. Rather, I aim to offer theoretical and methodological possibilities for expanding our understanding of Caribbean literary magazines based on extant interdisciplinary paradigms in Caribbean studies. I elect the term literary magazine as opposed to cultural journal or little magazine to name the sources of this archive for several reasons. In Spanish language history, the literary and cultural revista includes magazines that are explicitly literary alongside those that are more interdisciplinary and commercial. And the framework of the little magazine and Petit Revue utilized for the study of literary modernisms in English and French are more explicitly literary conceptions of magazines or journals. Furthermore, I am interested in conceptualizing literary magazines that emerge out of, and in many cases against, empire, and their timelines across the South Atlantic, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa from the 19th century to the present both include and exceed the timeline of the little magazine. I seek to use language that may address publications large and small, depoliticized as well as political periodicals, and the hybrid formation of the literature and politics magazine that recurs throughout the Caribbean in the 20th century. Finally, however, I'm interested in enunciating both the relative literariness of a broad range of periodicals and the bellicose etymology of the magazine. As Jill Lepore indicates, the metaphor is to weapons. A magazine is literally an arsenal. A piece is a firearm. A magazine is an arsenal of knowledge. It is also a library, dissected. Bits of this book and bits of that. A magazine is a library knowledge cut into bits so that more people can use it. Lepore's etymological portrait of the magazine as somewhere between an arsenal and a library translates well to the work of Caribbean literary magazines writing against the grain of empire. Tropique deployed poetry in Martinique as an intellectual weapon against the Vichy regime ruling over France and its empire, while functioning as an itinerant library to replace the insufficiently stocked colonial library. Gaceta del Caribe and Orígenes were engaged in a highly politicized literary battle for the terms that would shape the Cuban literary canon, both of which combated Cuba's imperial subjection in differing and even conflicting ways. BIM, in turn, critically confronted colonial ideology in the West Indies by compiling a library of local regional short fiction. In all four of these cases, the collection of pieces served as a moving library as well as a weapon of literary representation and circulation. Up against the imperial Goliath of the global book industry, these Caribbean literary magazines waged a guerrilla pursuit of geopolitical and literary dimensions for the terms of Caribbean representation. All right, so now I'm going to just read a little bit from this section on literary infrastructure. Discursively producing and circulating Caribbean location writing would be shaped by the minimalism of publishing infrastructure across the region. Small, private, or state-owned presses were the primary means at the disposition of writers in the colonies, neo-colonies, and struggling states of the 20th century Caribbean. and these most often required self-financing or the purchasing of subscriptions. While there may have been cases of capital-backed publishing companies located in the insular Caribbean that financed book production for local writers during the early to mid-20th century, if they existed, they were rare. For example, Derek Walcott's mother financed the publication of 25 poems, his first book of verse, and he sold it himself along with his friends for $1. Although Walcott has become one of the most read Caribbean authors and has won a Nobel Prize, his first and second self-published books are out of circulation today. These books served Walcott's career at home, but his contacts in London that would make his career possible were facilitated by his work being sent to Frank Collymore, the editor of the Barbados-based literary magazine BIM, where he also published early poems. The magazine, however fragile and limited as infrastructure, offered writers a way to publish at home and circulate both at home and abroad. In cases such as Walcott's, magazines facilitated the possibility of book publishing abroad, where robust infrastructure was backed by capital investments. Throughout the Caribbean, during at least the first half of the 20th century, writers most often sought literary infrastructure abroad to publish books, that is, if they could, as available infrastructures for bookmaking at home were highly limited. By literary infrastructure, I mean the book industry that includes publishers, editors, and mechanisms of national, regional, and international literary circulation. I also refer to small-scale institutions that provide literary training, facilitate and promote the circulation of literary texts, and consecrate literary value, including commercial, non-commercial, academic, and state-supported cultural projects. Finally, my understanding of literary infrastructure also includes the smallest scale variety: independent presses, literary magazines, literary associations, and specialized small book production. Although fragile, these forms of literary infrastructure have sustained the development of Caribbean literatures, just as if they had carried many marginal and avant-garde literary movements throughout the world. Given the importance of literature to various forms of social cohesion, it is not surprising that the European and US empires that have dominated the geopolitical existence of the insular Caribbean have not readily invested in literary infrastructure throughout the archipelago. The lack of infrastructure, combined with race and gender hierarchies, seems to have made it even more challenging for talented women writers to circulate and be remembered for the great influences they were in their time. If it had been easier to publish at home, perhaps the play Suzanne Césaire wrote might not have been lost. Likewise, perhaps the novel written by the still little-known writer Jan Williams, who supported Collymore with the production of BIM, would not remain lost. But even canonized men were greatly impacted by the dearth of literary infrastructure. As George Lamming has averred of his own experience in both Barbados and Trinidad as a young writer, you can't think of any cultural infrastructure that could have accommodated something called the novel. I think it's Lamming's birthday today, actually. So happy birthday to George Lamming, to whom I and this project owe much. Lamming would not, in fact, complete his first novel until he moved to London in 1950. Aimé Césaire would also publish his books abroad in France or in translation elsewhere, with the exception of magazine and newspaper publishing. Nicolás Guillén, one of the few canonized Black writers in Cuba who participated in the Spanish language Afrocentric literary movement known as Negrismo or Afrocubanismo, was able to finance the publication of his first book of poems in 1931, Songoroko Songo, because he won the lottery. If getting a book contract that financed production had been readily accessible to talented writers, perhaps there would be more published Negrita and Afro-Cubanista books by Black writers. So I'm going to pause for now, and I'll show you a little outline of the chapters of my book. And I have been tired of hearing myself for some time, so I look forward to hearing from others.
Thank you. I think I have to put my video back on.
Let me
here.
stop my share, yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Katerina. That was great. And we are so excited for your book to come out. We have a couple of questions, but I was hoping I could have a bit of a chair's, that privilege of the chair space, that I can perhaps open up with a couple of questions. You mentioned at the very start of your talk that when you decided to work on magazines, and you go through that kind of existential moment when you're like, oh gosh, what should I do this? What is the reason behind doing this? And how can I do it? But you said that you were overwhelmed once you began. And I was wondering if you could talk, because I don't know I know that there are people in the audience who have been working on magazines a lot, but others might not be so familiar with what it is to go through this process. And, you mentioned magazines that are really long-lived. And I mean, the 40s, you have a magazine like Orígenes, which has a really, really healthy run, but you also have others that run for, a couple of months, if maybe a year. Tell us a bit more about that experience of of how working through magazines is overwhelming, and anecdotes also welcome.
Sure. I mean, I know you know this well, and so do a lot of people who are here. But and I address this a little bit as I think about, what the temporality. Imagine the reading temporality of a literary magazine in the Caribbean in this period. But yeah, so one of the things that, something that struck me sort of early on was seeing which European writers some magazines chose to publish, and like not at all understanding, having like the books to go to for, what those relationships were. Let me think about like something very specific anecdotally. So one of the things that the work on Tropique started early, because I was going there, because what I wanted to find was why how one of the writers who I most admired in Caribbean literature, Aimé Césaire, connected to this to a group of writers that I was also studying in Cuba. And so in Tropique, I was really excited to find that there's this whole theory of poetry going on and building throughout the course of the magazine that I felt like had gotten very little attention, because all of the attention was had presumed that what Tropique was doing, because André Breton said so, was surrealism, right? And that and while Tropique certainly has this extraordinary Black consciousness project, that project is linked to a vision of poetics and an idea of the relationship between poetry and the world that, in the end, I find sits in a very complicated relationship to two sort of divergent views of literature that come out in Cuba during this time, between the Orígenes group and the Gaceta del Caribe group. But I'm trying to, another thing that happened that probably has happened to you and others is that I would go look for things, and in national libraries, the one in France stands out, but this certainly happened in Cuba as well. And they just wouldn't be there. Like the things would be cataloged and they would be missing. And so there was a lot of like that stuff that had either been stolen or like somehow held back from the archive in terms of periodical history. So magazine issues, the one that I really wanted to find at the National Library in Spain. Actually, my mother was in Madrid and she did me the favor of going to look for it, an issue of the Venezuelan magazine Viernes that had been republished from in Tropique, translated and republished from in Tropique. The issue that I needed was missing from the National Library. That was something that was troubling. And then the whole process always made me think about imperial infrastructure and the irony of looking for decolonial literature in these contexts that are so structured by empire, right? The actual wood of the National Library in France coming from the Amazon, for example, I found out as I was there. So there are different kinds of overwhelm, I think.
Yeah. No, that's familiar, and also I get very frustrated for you when the one is never to be found. It becomes a kind of Freudian dilemma. So, and also this, I love your framework of infrastructure, because it works at so many levels. Not only does the imperial infrastructure operate, work on the way that the way that we inherit the history of magazines. It's so kind of informed by one voice. You mentioned Breton, and how do we, dig into that infrastructure and break it apart so that we can go in there into the archive and find something altogether different and refreshing. And we have to kind of break those models apart. So I think that in terms of a framework, of theoretical framework and a methodological framework, the concept of institutional infrastructures and how they are so layered and have so many different nuances to it, I think it's really, really useful and very important, I think, and a very great contribution. So I see that there are 4 questions, gosh, already.
Can I just say something real quick to that, quick,
please.
And then we'll turn to the question. Thank you so much for saying that about infrastructure. And I think, to add something that is sort of maybe more broad, I think, of course, my own relationship to the imperial infrastructures of the US Academy has always been highly on my mind as I did this work. And, I was convinced early on by friends and collaborators in Cuba that because I had access to this infrastructure, therefore it was my job to basically use it as much as possible and to figure out, how much I can sort of contribute to making more visible the work that's being done by people from the Caribbean, and that I rely on very heavily for my work. And then I think it's worth saying that I'm working on a project of making digitally accessible with my collaborator Alex Gill at Columbia, an archive of Caribbean magazines and a database for searching them and accessing them. And I hope some of the people here are definitely people I will go to for, Alex and I will go to for participating in that, because you can't think about infrastructure without thinking about how to move it, I suppose.
Oh, that's brilliant news. And I think magazine scholars everywhere will be very thankful, because digitalization is I think the way to preserve now, and the way that we have to move and quickly as well. Okay, so I'm going to move over to our questions. We have quite a few at the moment. Catherine asks, hi there, is there a reason that you'd use the term literary magazines and not literary journals? She's curious about terminology and what that might mean. Also, there's a second question, if you were to map these literary magazines, does Cuba take an overdetermined or determining role after the revolution?
Okay. Should I start with that one a little bit?
Yeah, so we'll move one by one if we can.
After the revolution. Okay, thank you, Katie, for being here and for your work. I think you might have put the question in before I went over the Lepore etymology, but that, I was really struck, and I'm really grateful that Francis Nergal Montaner drew my attention to that Lepore piece, because it's really beautiful. And of course I fact checked it. And it's not the only etymology of the magazine, of course, but it's one that's there. And, and there's some critiques of of turning to discourses of war, but there are some of the magazine cases in which discourses of war and the sort of the bellicose part of the etymology of the magazine seems to me really apt for this work, and a specific kind of what I see as a kind of battle for for how the Caribbean will circulate in the world as a space, a battle against the imperial version of the Caribbean. So that bellicose etymology is the primary one that I use to distinguish from journal, but I'm also not opposed. Sometimes I use periodicals, because there are always periodicals, and there's a lot of important stuff that happen in newspapers. It's just, that's not what I'm looking at, because it's a different relationship to infrastructure, quite honestly. And then, I sort of thought about studying magazines after 1959 in Cuba, and I certainly know a lot of them. It's a very different structure. It's closer to what happens in the Haitian magazine Cahiers d'Haïti, that's state-sponsored. in the 1940s, I think, part of what happens in the politically overdetermined Cuban context after the 60s. But in my future work, I'll definitely be writing about those. And if you are, I hope we can discuss it at some point. Go ahead.
Can you tell us the title of the Jill Lepore piece, by any chance?
Yeah. That's the autobiography of, or not autobiography, sorry. It's called The Book of Ages, and it's her book on, I believe it's Jane Franklin, right?
Okay, right.
Right here. Yeah, The Book of Ages, the life and opinions of Jane Franklin.
Okay, brilliant. It's a beautiful quote. I agree. We have a question from Yolanda Martinez San Miguel. Hi, Yolanda. So she's everybody's congratulating you on the new book. And she asks, can you talk a little bit about the literary genres that were included or privileged in these literary magazines, and what they had to offer to the conversation about a pan-Caribbean identity that took place outside of the genre of the novel? So excellent question there.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question, Yolanda. And Yolanda's been an extraordinary mentor and collaborator to me in the process of putting this book together. And you might remember an early version of my project that was more genre focused, but it's something that still marks the chapters, so that in my work on Tropique, I focus on poetics, and not poetry only, although I look at some an understudied segment of what would later become part of M.S. Désairs' Cahiers d'un retour binatal, but that wasn't in the first version of the poem that comes out in Tropique, alongside the sort of intertextual theory of poetry in Tropique. And then I focus on literary criticism, primarily book reviews to other criticism in my work on Gaceta del Caribe and Orígenes, but I also look a little bit, there is like a novel moment. There's one novel moment, I have to say, in the book. And it's because it's important, because I found that Alejo Carpentier had written a different version of the preface to El Reino de este Mundo, and that it came out in Gaceta del Caribe as part of an early chapter to that novel. But yeah, I mean, and then my work on BIM focuses on short fiction. And I sort of had this sense early on, and I'm not sure that it's true about every magazine, but it definitely seemed to be true about these. And I wonder, I mean, it dropped out of the main argument of my book, but to what extent do certain literary genres drive literary magazines? And certainly the other way to deal with genre that does come up in my book, and has to do with the conversation that I was very fortunate to have with George Lamming as I did my research. And it was, Lamming said to me that the genres that he wrote in, poetry and short fiction, right before going to London, were constrained by the infrastructure, right? Mm-hmm. And there were novel versions. I mean, as you know quite well, Maria and Yolanda know this as well, early, like serial novels, of course, that predate this in many contexts, including the Caribbean. But they're not as present in the archive I was looking at. I'd love someone else to answer that question, because I do not answer that. But I think that I guess the other thing implied in your question is we presume that the novel is the one that does that work of creating identity, and perhaps the novel does work that pertains to the nation, but that these other genres are more fitting for archipelagic constructions of community beyond the nation. But I don't argue that in my book. I just said that now. I don't know. I'm not sure.
A book is a developing conversation with yourself and with others, isn't it? But I think, I mean, because I work on much earlier periods, and the absence of not the infrastructure also has to do with material stuff. You mentioned the lack of paper, the absence of paper, how certain materials are just expensive, and the magazine, provides, a way for people to get their work out there. So it's not only a matter of like the ability to work, the ability to sit down, write something long, but it's also the ability to produce something that is materially possible. But again, I don't work in the period that you work in. So thank you for that. I'm going to move on to the next question from Rachel. congratulating you again. And she's asking whether you found any significant differences across magazines from the various contexts of the Anglophone, Francophone, and Hispanophone Caribbean, because I mean, this is a really ambitious project in the way that you're trying to create this map of all these different traditions. So yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Rachel. I think, sure. I mean, but I'm not sure that the differences have to do with the languages as much as they have to do with the relationship, the particular like state, non-state configuration to empire in the magazine, so that there's much more of, there's a tension between nationalist discourses and regional or internationalist or non-political discourses in the Cuban magazines that have to do with the fact that Cuba is a, you know, a neo-colonial nation in this moment. And then there's a sort of a difference in the way that the other differences are sort of Orígenes is more like BIM, because there's a kind of eschewing of the political in the editorial framework to some extent in both of those magazines that are more aestheticized, that pertain to what, you know, Rafael Daleo has called the ideology of the literary. I think it's a really useful way of thinking about a lot of Caribbean magazines. But then Tropique is much more politically engaged, the Marxist orientation that is closer to the Gaceta del Caribe publication, and yet aesthetically differs somewhat significantly in its approach to a Marxist aesthetic engagement. So there are lots of differences. And then of course there are other magazines that I look at in a more comparative chapter from Haiti and the Dominican Republic that have, you know, other differences among them. But I think the thing that I'll say, and thank you for the question and the congratulations, Rachel, I'm touched. I highlighted this thing that I wish I had written more about, and it's this, I think there's a preponderance of a genre in the 20th century, and magazines that I've seen, like between the 20s and the 60s at least, of the politics and arts or politics and literature magazine. I think that's a genre that is probably indebted to, you know, the very influential African-American literary magazine, The Crisis, and other African-American literary magazines that circulated in the Caribbean. That's like, I have, you know, that's like an under fleshed out idea, but it's signaled, there are footnotes and in the book about that. But yeah, that there's a sort of range between like magazines that are political, magazines that are very aestheticized, and then this kind of intermediary, like we do politics and literature here, kind of magazine across the different contexts.
And that makes me wonder how many of these magazines are conceived as brand new projects, or how much they're conceived as kind of the inheritors of an older tradition within these islands. And the reason I'm asking that is because so much of the late 19th century tradition, for example, and the early 20th century are these kind of eclectic magazines, arts and science and industry, you know, and so how much do you, I was wondering how much you see them as a kind of, as breaks from the old, as truly revolutionary in that sense, or how much they kind of see themselves as part of a tradition of magazine culture within a specific island.
No, I think that, thank you for that. I mean, I'm not going to establish them as a break because I haven't done enough research to suggest that I can like mark a rupture. I think you're probably right that there is to some extent a continuity, but I think there are certain social and political concerns, you know, that have to do with empire, that have to do with racialized forms of dispossession, that drive some magazines' concerns to have not just the sort of miscellaneous approach to different disciplines, but like to have a specifically political, social engagement alongside an investment in aesthetics as a way of intervening in the political and the social. And I think that if there's a break, and I can't locate like the year of the break in different contexts, but there are 19th century magazines produced in the Caribbean that use the vocabulary of Caribbeanness that are explicitly colonial publications. And so I can't tell you like exactly where that break is, but that these magazines are participating. In some ways, it's seeming kind of late in what reads like an initiatory, like an incipient regionalism, right? So,
interesting. Yeah. Well, I'm going to move on to another question because I see that more are coming through and I want to get through all of them. This is from Angelique. Speaking broadly, she asked, there is a Eurocentric tendency to consider that writing and literature from the Caribbean doesn't quite match the quality of those ordinarily considered to form part of the British canon. Is the question of quality and or comparison with European writing discussed with the same vigor in Caribbean literary journals?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for asking that question, because that sort of, that idea about quality is one of the Eurocentric myths that I sort of, set out to write against in different kinds of ways. And I guess before I answer your specific question, to address it a little bit, the question of infrastructure, the intervention about infrastructure, like really drawing attention to this thing that a lot of us know, and especially, and like almost every writer from the Caribbean knows like very closely and intimately how this structure of the infrastructural divide, or what Lino Nolascalvo called the infrastructural distance of the Caribbean from Europe in particular, and in some cases from the US, works. One of the reasons to draw attention to this is that there are these forms of criticism that start to sort of be like, oh, and this is how we're going to look at how the auto-exoticism worked in Caribbean writing, without any attention to what the material dynamics at stake in the production of what the critic reads as an auto-exoticist version of a text, as if, and sometimes one wonders like what authorizes one to call out someone else's so-called auto-exoticism. And so the question comes up, Angelique, if I may, in the journals in a number of different ways. So there are a lot of really good examples. There's a famous example in which Suzanne Césaire calls out what she calls la littérature doudou, or tourist exoticist literature, that she is calling out Martinican writers for sort of imitating an exoticist tourist approach to Caribbean literature produced by foreigners in the Caribbean. And so there's this sort of, I referred to Lino Nolascalvo, who has a wonderful essay in the second page of the first issue of Gaceta del Caribe on, both infrastructure and ideology that sort of convince people in Cuba that their literature doesn't matter, and how infrastructure and ideology combine through processes of empire, and both the Spanish and the U.S. empire, to create a local derision for Caribbean literature. There, in BIM, it comes up to go specifically to the British canon in Collingwood's call to writers to write the local. This idea that is sort of, this has become like a tenet of post-colonial literary studies, right? That what the colonial education does is tell you that literature lives somewhere else, right? That its settings are elsewhere, and there's a calling back. So it's like an indirect way that this is addressed. And what gets addressed over and over again is the internalization, and especially in a class way, in the middle class of the reading public, of local reading public, that derides the local artist as a sort of tragic consequence of the broad infrastructural and ideological context of empire.
Thank you, Katerina. And now we have two more questions. So I'm going to try and see if we can do this. This one is from Philip. How do you deal with the contradiction shown by someone like Collymore, who was a strong regionalist and a conservative who consciously fed Anglophone literature into the British mainstream?
Yes. Well, first, Philip, thank you for being here, and I love your work, and your work on Collymore is very important to the research that I did on BIM. I I think that, I mean, it's a kind of contradictory thing about BIM. And so one of the ways that I deal with the contradiction in some ways is subtle. I think that BIM exceeds Collymore's politics in a number of ways. I mean, I think that one of the ways to answer your question about consciously feeding Anglophone literature into the British mainstream is that there wasn't anywhere else to publish. And so that was a material move also that supported, you know, the very livelihood of a lot of writers. And Collymore functions himself. I mean, I think you suggest this in a way yourself in an essay on Collymore as a threshold, that Collymore is like a kind of, you know, functioning like infrastructure himself. And there are a lot of writers and editors in the Caribbean who, in addition to the magazine work, did so much other labor to connect writers. And I mean, this exists. I mean, a lot of people are like this, and there are people like this in a lot of contexts, to sort of function as a kind of like maker of bridges. How I think the Collymore's conservatism manifests in BIM in the 40s, and I focus on BIM in the 40s because it's so voluminous, and the project is really primarily a 40s project that then opens up to these ideas and questions about the magazine medium, is that, you know, some people will sort of flat out position BIM as an anti-colonial magazine, but it doesn't seem, I sort of call it colonial critical. Like it doesn't reach a political force in the 40s that some might have expected, and that might have to do with Collymore's politics, and that might have to do with other factors. But yeah, thank you for the question. I hope I've addressed it.
Great, thank you so much, Katerina. And I think we can squeeze the last question in. This is from Iraida. Thanking you for your presentation. Did you come across any issues, for example, events, ideas, or concepts that gave rise to Pan-Caribbean debates across the magazines? And did they engage with one another in any way? This is a question that I had, whether there were like guests that appeared in certain magazines from another part of the archipelago. Yeah, so yeah, great question. Thank you, Iraida.
Thank you so much, Iraida, for being here and for your work and that wonderful question. I think I would say how to focus on this one. It's like yes and no. So I expected to find a lot, in some ways, a lot more connectivity. There's more connection between between Cuba and the Francophone context, and between the Francophone context and other parts of Latin America than there are connections to BIM outside of the English-speaking world in this moment. It isn't until 1950 that in BIM you see the first translated works of Francophone literature. I think it's 1950, but it might be 51. So it's sort of at the end of the decade in this period. And some of the issues or sort of the recurring stuff that comes up, I mean, I address a little bit the way that Aimé Césaire is received in Cuba. He's, you know, one of his poems is published in Orígenes, and there are some extraordinary reviews in Gaceta del Caribe, both of his work and of Virgilio Piñera's work that was accused of being derivative of Césaire's work in Cuba in this time. And so that comes up, and then back in Tropique, then Tropique publishes Lidia Cabrera and essays on Wilfredo Lam. And then Tropique and Gaceta del Caribe republished from the Haitian state backed publication Calle d'Haïti. And so they're both connected there. And there's an oblique connection to Jacques Humain from the Tropique group, because Humain was in Martinique for a little bit of the 40s, and then he was in Cuba for a longer period. And, and Guillen had his novel, Gouverneur de la José, when he died, right? So, but you asked about debates, and I'm like listing specific connections. In terms of the debates, there's less connectivity in the debates, but I engaged their kind of debates about politics and aesthetics, and try to bring them into conversation throughout the book, even when they're not directly connected. Yeah.
That's brilliant. Well, and this is a great moment to say thank you, but also the fact that your book is coming out is very exciting, because we can continue kind of seeing your thoughts about magazines across, and it's such an interesting, ambitious, but also incredibly necessary project. We thank you very much. And we also thank you very much, Katerina, for being here, for joining the Caribbean Studies Network. As I said at the beginning, we are hosted by the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities. We have a massive gap at Oxford in Caribbean studies. This is basically the first organization of Caribbean scholars, and we rely on you, on the audience, and our guests to help us grow as a community. And we are so very grateful for all of you for being here today. And we're thankful to you, Katerina. We look forward to reading your book. I have pre-ordered mine. I invite everybody to just get on your preferred book website to get it. It's coming out in August. So
Maria, do I have time to give everybody the discount code?
Well, do you have a discount code?
I have a discount code that I would be more than happy to share.
This is wonderful.
Shoot, Maria, I'm Cuban. Of course, I want everyone to get the discount.
We want the deal.
And to be able to get the book. So if you just give me 1 second.
Yeah, this is great. This has never happened, I think, in the Caribbean Studies Network.
It's probably not like super doxporiano de
no, para nada.
Compartir el código.
Hay que compartir todo tipo de descuento.
Yeah. But thank you so much to everyone for being here while I pull up the discount code. And I don't know if I interrupted you, Maria, and if you want to say something else while I pull it up.
A very efficacious way to conclude.
I mean, I have this flyer. So what I'll do is I'll put the flyer into, the flyer has the discount code on it. And for those of you like Maria who already ordered it without the discount code, I apologize. You could have asked me. I would have given you the discount code though.
I didn't know.
1 second. All right, I'm struggling to get the document, so I'll just give you the code. And
we'll write it out. So you go through Rutgers University Press to get it?
Yeah, for the code, you have to order from Rutgers University Press.
Yeah.
And for the discount, and let's see, I guess, is there a way to send, to the panelists and attendees? That's the code. Yeah. 30% off for whoever wants it.
Great. So it's RFLR19. So if you haven't seen it in the chat, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Katerina, for being here. And now, Katerina, you stick around, but everybody else, we can say bye-bye and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
The numbers are going down.